Sometimes the most terrifying order is the one that sounds perfectly normal. The British guard's voice cut through the damp morning air of the temporary POW camp in northern Germany. It was early spring of 1945, and a thin gray fog hung low over the rows of wooden barracks. Boots pressed into wet gravel as soldiers moved between lines of German women prisoners gathered in the yard. Many of the women looked exhausted, their coats hanging loose, their faces pale from months of uncertainty. The guard held a wooden crate and began tossing out small white bars one by one. Soap. The bars landed softly in the dirt near their feet. All prisoners will proceed to the shower house, he announced firmly. Soap has been provided. To the British soldiers, it sounded like a simple order. Hygiene, procedure, routine. But something strange happened the moment the words settled into the air. The women didn't move. Not one step. Instead, the line of prisoners seemed to freeze as if time itself had slowed. One bar of soap rolled gently across the ground and stopped beside a woman's worn boot. She stared down at it like it was something alive. Her name was Anna Keller, though none of the guards knew that yet. Her fingers began to tremble slightly. Another prisoner bent down to pick up a bar of soap but stopped halfway, her hand hovering inches above it. A quiet murmur passed through the line. Then someone whispered two words that barely carried across the cold yard. Not again. A British corporal frowned. Move along, he repeated, gesturing toward the small wooden building that served as the camp's shower house about 50 feet away. Still no one stepped forward. Instead, a soft sound broke the silence. A woman near the middle of the line began to cry. Not loudly, just a quiet, shaking breath that escaped before she could stop it. Another woman covered her mouth. Then another. Within seconds, several prisoners were wiping tears from their faces. The soldiers exchanged confused looks. They had expected complaints, maybe reluctance, but not this. One guard nudged a bar of soap closer to the line with the tip of his boot. It slid across the dirt and stopped again in front of Anna Keller. She stared at it for a long moment. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't. Find the strength. Finally, in a voice so soft it almost disappeared in the morning fog, she whispered, "Please, no soap." The guard blinked in disbelief. "It's just a shower," he replied. But the reaction only grew stranger. Several women stepped back instead of forward. One prisoner dropped the soap she had been holding as if it had suddenly burned her hand. The small white bar struck the ground with a dull thud. And for a moment, the entire camp yard felt unnaturally still. Across the yard, a British nurse had just stepped out of the medical barracks. Her name was Emily Carter. She paused when she noticed the frozen line of prisoners and the uneasy expressions on the guards' faces. Something about the scene didn't make sense. Prisoners usually resisted orders loudly. These women were doing the opposite. They looked terrified. Emily took a few steps closer, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. From where she stood, she could see the soap scattered across the ground. She could see the tears forming on faces that had already endured far too much war. And she could hear one sentence being whispered again and again among the women, like a memory none of them could escape. They said that, before. Emily frowned slightly. Before what? She didn't know it yet, but within the next few minutes, a single small detail would make the entire yard fall silent. Emily Carter slowed her steps as she approached the line of prisoners. From a distance of about 20 yards, she could already see that something was deeply wrong. The women were not arguing or resisting like prisoners sometimes did when they were exhausted. They were standing still as statues, their eyes fixed on the bars of soap scattered across the damp ground. One woman pressed both hands tightly over her mouth as if she was trying to hold back a memory that had suddenly forced its way into the present. Another woman stared toward the shower building, a small wooden structure with a metal pipe running along its roofline, and her shoulders began to shake. Emily had worked in field hospitals for nearly 3 years. She had seen wounded soldiers arrive covered in mud and smoke, men who had crossed entire battlefields without showing fear. But the look on these women's faces was different. This was not the fear of injury. This was something older, something buried much deeper. A British corporal near the front of the line rubbed the back of his neck in confusion. "I do not understand," he muttered quietly to another guard. "It is only a shower." He stepped forward and lifted one of the bars of soap from the ground. "Look," he said, holding it up for the prisoners to see. "Soap. Water. Nothing more." The explanation did nothing to calm them. In fact, the reaction became even stranger. A woman near the end of the line suddenly took 2 steps backward. Another shook her head slowly as tears slid down her face. The sound of quiet crying drifted through the cold air like a soft wind through dry leaves. Emily stopped about 10 feet away from the group. She watched carefully, her mind moving through possibilities. Illness, shock, hunger. None of those quite fit what she was seeing. Her eyes moved from face to face until they settled again on the woman who had spoken earlier. Anna Keller stood perfectly still, her gaze lowered toward the soap lying near her boots. Her hands were clenched so tightly that the knuckles had turned pale. Emily noticed the small tremor running through her fingers. It was not the trembling of cold weather. It was the kind that came from memory. Emily took one more step closer. The gravel beneath her boots made a soft crunch that caused several of the prisoners to glance toward her. One woman whispered something in German that Emily could not fully understand, but a single word reached her clearly. Shower. Then another voice followed, barely louder than a breath. They said that before. Emily felt a faint chill move through her chest. She had heard stories over the past year. Rumors carried by soldiers, fragments of reports from liberated towns, quiet conversations among medics late at night. Places where people had been told to wash, to step inside, to wait. She did not want to assume anything. Not yet. The corporal sighed impatiently and gestured again toward the building 50 feet away. Come along now, he said, trying to keep his tone calm. You will feel better after washing. The words had the opposite effect. Anna Keller suddenly lifted her head. Her eyes were filled with fear so raw that Emily felt it from across the small distance between them. Anna looked at the soap again, then at the shower building, and slowly shook her head. Her voice came out weak, but clear enough for the soldiers to hear. Please, she said. No soap. The yard fell quiet again. The guards exchanged puzzled looks, unsure whether they were dealing with stubbornness or something else entirely. Emily's attention drifted back to Anna's hands. As Anna shifted slightly, the sleeve of her worn coat pulled back just enough to reveal a thin line of faded ink on the inside of her wrist. Emily stepped closer without thinking. At first she could only see numbers. Then the meaning of those numbers reached her like a sudden wave of cold water. Emily Carter felt the air leave her lungs as she stared at the faded ink on Anna Keller's wrist. The numbers were small, slightly blurred with time, but unmistakable. They had not been written with a pen. They had been marked permanently, the kind of mark that turned a human being into a record. Emily had seen photographs in briefings months earlier, quiet reports passed between medical officers after the liberation of certain camps. She had hoped those images were rare, isolated pieces of a terrible war. But now the evidence stood directly in front of her. Anna noticed Emily's eyes resting on her wrist and instinctively pulled her sleeve down, hiding the numbers again as if she had revealed something deeply personal. Around them the camp yard remained frozen in uncertainty. The guards were still holding bars of soap, still pointing toward the small wooden shower building about 50 feet away, still waiting for movement that never came. The corporal cleared his throat, trying to maintain authority even though confusion was now spreading across his face. Nurse Carter, he called toward her. Is there a problem here? Emily did not answer right away. Her attention moved slowly along the line of prisoners. One by one she noticed the same subtle movement. Sleeves pulled lower, hands turning inward. Several women were hiding their wrists the moment they realized she was looking. A quiet understanding began to form in her mind. Anna Keller was not the only one. Emily took a careful step forward until she stood only a few feet from Anna. The young woman's breathing was uneven, as though every breath required effort. Her eyes were no longer on the guards or the building. They were fixed on the bars of soap lying in the dirt. Emily followed her gaze down to the ground. The soap looked completely ordinary. Small, square, plain white. Something every soldier used daily without a second thought. But the fear in the prisoners' faces told a very different story. Emily spoke gently. Anna, she said, using the name she had heard whispered by another prisoner. The sound of her own name made Anna lift her head slightly in surprise. Emily kept her voice calm, almost quiet enough that only the nearest women could hear. Why are you afraid of the soap? Anna swallowed before answering. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. Then her eyes drifted toward the shower building again. The wooden walls looked simple and harmless in the pale morning light. A thin metal pipe ran along the roof, and a faint trickle of water could be heard somewhere inside. Finally Anna spoke, her voice trembling like someone walking across fragile ice. Because, she whispered, they said the same thing before. Emily felt the meaning of those words settle slowly into the space around them. Anna continued, her eyes distant now, as if she was looking at a place far beyond the camp yard. They told us to shower. They gave us soap. They said it would be quick. Several women nearby began crying again, the memory spreading quietly through the line like a shared shadow. One prisoner covered her face with both hands. Another turned away completely from the building. Emily's heart tightened as the pieces finally connected. The order that had sounded simple to the guards carried a completely different meaning to these women. For them, the words shower and soap were not about cleanliness. They were echoes from a place where people had walked into a room expecting water and never trusted the door again. Emily turned slowly toward the corporal. He was still waiting for an explanation, still holding the bar of soap in his hand. She realized that in a matter of seconds, she would need to make a decision that would change the entire situation in the yard. Emily Carter turned slowly toward the British corporal, who was still waiting beside the scattered bars of soap. The morning fog drifted lightly across the yard, softening the edges of the wooden barracks and the narrow path that led to the shower building about 50 feet away. For a moment she did not speak. She simply looked at the soap in his hand, then back at the line of women whose fear had filled the quiet air. The corporal shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the growing silence. Nurse Carter, he repeated, his voice lower now. What is going on here? Emily stepped closer until she stood beside him. She leaned slightly toward him so the prisoners would not hear every word. Look at their wrists, she said quietly. The corporal frowned, unsure what she meant, but he followed her gaze down the line. One woman had already pulled her sleeve over her hand, hiding whatever had been there before. Another stood with both arms folded tightly against her chest. Finally, the corporal noticed a faint glimpse of faded ink on the wrist of a prisoner near the center of the group. He stared at it for a moment without understanding. Emily spoke again, her voice calm but serious. Those numbers were not written yesterday. The corporal's expression slowly changed as the realization reached him. He had heard stories as well. Every soldier had heard fragments by this point in the war. Rumors carried across Europe like distant thunder. Places where people had been lined up, counted, and marked with numbers instead of names. The corporal lowered the bar of soap slightly. You think, he began, but the sentence faded before he finished it. Emily nodded once. She did not need to explain further. Behind them, the prisoners remained motionless, watching every movement with the cautious attention of people who had learned that small details could mean the difference between safety and danger. Anna Keller stood near the front of the line, her eyes moving carefully between Emily and the soldiers. She did not speak again, but the tension in her shoulders had not eased. She was waiting. All of them were waiting. Emily took a slow breath and then did something unexpected. She reached toward the corporal's hand and gently took the bar of soap from him. The soldiers nearby watched in confusion as she stepped forward into the open space between the guards and the prisoners. The gravel crunched softly under her boots. She knelt down and placed the soap on the ground instead of handing it to anyone. The small white bar rested there in the damp dirt, simple and harmless, yet surrounded by the weight of memory. Emily straightened again and faced the line of women. Her voice was steady but quiet enough to remove the sharp edge of command. No one has to move right now, she said. The guards looked at one another. This was not part of the routine procedure they had expected to follow that morning. The corporal hesitated before speaking again. But the order was. Emily lifted a hand gently, stopping him before he finished the sentence. She kept her eyes on the prisoners as she spoke. Orders can wait. A light breeze passed through the yard, stirring the fog and carrying the faint sound of water running somewhere inside the shower building. Anna Keller heard the sound and flinched slightly. Emily noticed. She stepped a little closer to the line, reducing the distance between them to only a few feet. Listen, Emily said softly, her voice calm and patient. There is only water in that building. None of the women answered. Fear that had grown for years could not disappear in a few seconds. Emily understood that now. Trust would not return because someone told them it was safe. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly, moment by moment. And somewhere in the quiet space between the soldiers and the prisoners, Emily realized the next step would matter more than any order spoken that morning. Emily Carter stood quietly a few feet from the line of prisoners, allowing the silence to settle instead of rushing to fill it. The guards behind her shifted uneasily, their boots scraping lightly against the gravel as they tried to understand why the routine order had suddenly stopped. The small white bar of soap still rested in the dirt between them, simple and harmless to anyone who had never learned to fear it. The faint sound of water continued running somewhere inside the wooden shower building, steady and ordinary, but every prisoner seemed to hear it as something else entirely. Anna Keller kept her eyes on the ground for several long seconds. Her breathing had slowed slightly, but the tension in her shoulders remained. Around her the other women waited without speaking, each one measuring the distance between the past and the present. Emily understood that nothing she said could erase what those women had already lived through. Words alone would not be enough. Slowly she took another step forward, until she stood almost within arm's reach of Anna. The movement caused a ripple of attention through the line. Several prisoners lifted their heads cautiously, watching every detail. Emily bent down again and picked up the bar of soap from the ground. She held it in her palm, where everyone could see it clearly. The guards behind her watched in confusion, uncertain what she intended to do next. Emily turned the soap over once in her hand, examining it as if she had never seen one before. Then she spoke in a calm voice that carried gently across the yard. "This is only soap," she said. "Nothing more." The words were simple, but the women did not move. Emily expected that. Instead of stepping toward the shower building, she walked in the opposite direction. She moved past the prisoners, past the line entirely, until she stood about 20 feet away near a rain barrel that had been set beside one of the barracks. The barrel was half full from the storm that had passed through the night before. Without hesitation, Emily dipped her hand into the cold water and began to rub the soap slowly between her fingers. White foam appeared almost immediately. The small act seemed ordinary, almost quiet enough to go unnoticed, but every prisoner in the yard was watching now. Emily lifted her hands slightly so they could see the soap bubbles forming in the morning light. Then she rinsed her hands in the barrel and wiped them gently against her coat. "Just soap," she repeated softly. The guards exchanged looks, but said nothing. Anna Keller's eyes followed the movement carefully. For the first time since the order had been given, something in her expression shifted. The fear had not disappeared, but a thin line of doubt had appeared beside it. She glanced toward the shower building again, then back toward Emily. The water could still be heard running through the pipes inside, steady and unchanging. Emily returned slowly to the space between the guards and the prisoners. She placed the bar of soap on a wooden crate nearby rather than handing it to anyone. Then she folded her hands calmly in front of her and waited. No one spoke for several seconds. The entire yard seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Anna Keller lifted one foot and moved it forward by a few inches. It was a small step, barely noticeable to someone standing farther away, but the women beside her saw it immediately. The distance between fear and trust had narrowed just a little. And in that quiet moment, every soldier in the yard realized that what happened next would not be decided by orders at all. Anna Keller's small step forward did not break the silence in the yard, but it changed the shape of it. The distance she moved was barely 6 inches, yet every woman in the line noticed. The guards noticed too. Emily Carter remained still, careful not to rush the moment. She understood that fear built over years could not disappear in a few minutes. Trust returned slowly, the way light returns after a long night. Anna's eyes moved again toward the wooden shower building standing about 50 feet away. The thin metal pipe along its roof gave a faint rattle as water continued flowing through it. To the soldiers it was just plumbing, a simple system set up for hygiene in the temporary camp. But for the prisoners the sound carried a memory that had never fully left them. Anna's breathing grew slightly uneven again as she listened. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if measuring the distance between the past she remembered and the present she was standing in now. Around her the other women waited carefully, watching the small change in her posture. Some of them still held their arms tightly across their chests. Others stared at the ground where several bars of soap still rested in the damp dirt. Emily spoke again, but this time her voice was even softer than before. "You decide," she said. The words were not an order. They were an invitation. The guards behind her shifted quietly, unsure whether to intervene, but the corporal raised a hand slightly to keep them back. Even he understood that forcing movement now would only deepen the fear they had just begun to ease. Anna opened her eyes again and looked directly at Emily for the first time. There was caution in that look, but also curiosity. She had watched the nurse wash her own hands in the rain barrel only moments earlier. She had seen the soap turn to foam and then disappear harmlessly in the water. It had been such a small demonstration, yet it had planted a quiet doubt. Inside the wall of fear she carried, Anna slowly unclenched her hands. The movement was subtle, but Emily noticed it immediately. The tension in Anna's fingers loosened just enough for her to lift one hand and brush a strand of hair away from her face. As her sleeve shifted again, the faint numbers on her wrist became visible for a second time. This time Anna did not hide them. Emily saw the moment clearly. It was not just a physical movement. It was the first sign that Anna was allowing the present moment to exist separately from the past. Anna turned her head slightly toward the other prisoners. Their eyes were on her now. Some looked frightened, others hopeful, but none of them spoke. She understood that whatever she did next might shape what the rest of them would believe about this place. Anna looked back at the shower building again. The wooden door stood slightly open. No guards were standing beside it now. No orders were being shouted. The only sound was the quiet rush of water inside. She took another small step forward. This one was a little steadier than the first. The gravel shifted under her boots as she moved about 1 foot closer to the path that led toward the building. A quiet murmur passed through the line of women behind her. It was not fear this time. It sounded more like fragile surprise. Emily did not move. She simply watched. Anna Keller stood still again after that second step, staring toward the open doorway and listening to the water. For the first time since the morning order had been given, the possibility of walking forward no longer seemed impossible. Anna Keller stood still for several seconds after taking her second step forward. The gravel beneath her boots had shifted with a soft crunch that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet yard. Every woman behind her had heard it. Every guard had seen it. Yet no one spoke. The morning fog had begun to thin slightly, and a pale line of sunlight slipped through the clouds, touching the roof of the wooden shower building ahead. The door remained open just a few inches. The sound of water running inside continued at the same steady rhythm, simple and ordinary, like a small stream flowing somewhere out of sight. Anna listened to it carefully. For a long time, that sound had meant something else in her memory. Years ago, it had been the last ordinary sound people heard before stepping into rooms they believed were safe. The memory was not loud in her mind, but it was persistent, like a shadow that moved with every step. Behind her, the other prisoners waited in silence. Some of them had begun watching the building instead of the ground. Others kept their eyes on Anna, as if her movement might show them what the present moment truly meant. Emily Carter remained where she stood, about 6 feet away, her hands loosely folded in front of her coat. She had learned during the war that patience could sometimes be more powerful than command. Anna slowly lifted her eyes again and looked toward Emily. The nurse did not speak. She simply gave a small nod, the kind someone might give when standing beside a nervous friend before a difficult moment. That quiet gesture carried no pressure. It only offered reassurance. Anna took a slow breath and then turned her body slightly toward the narrow path that led to the shower building. The distance from where she stood to the doorway was about 50 feet. It did not look like much space, yet it felt longer than a mile inside her mind. She placed 1 foot forward and began walking. The movement was careful at first. Each step seemed measured, as if she was testing the ground beneath her boots. The gravel shifted again with a soft scraping sound. A faint murmur moved through the line of prisoners behind her. It was not panic. It sounded more like quiet disbelief. No one had expected someone to move so soon. Anna walked about 10 feet and then stopped. The water inside the building could be heard more clearly now. It echoed faintly through the wooden walls, steady and unchanged. She studied the doorway carefully. There were no guards standing beside it anymore. No one was blocking the entrance. No one was shouting instructions. Emily watched from behind without following. She understood that this part of the journey belonged entirely to Anna. Trust could not be escorted. It had to be chosen. Anna took another breath and continued forward. 20 feet now. The door was closer, the dark interior just visible beyond the frame. She could see a metal pipe along the wall and the outline of several simple shower heads above the floor. Nothing about the room looked threatening. Nothing looked hidden. Still, The memory tried to whisper that appearances had been deceiving once before. Anna paused again about 15 feet from the door. She turned her head slightly and glanced back at the other women. Dozens of eyes were watching her now. Some faces still carried fear. Others carried hope, so fragile it barely showed. Emily stood quietly among the guards, her calm presence unchanged. Anna understood what the others were waiting for. They were not waiting for orders anymore. They were waiting to see if the future could truly be different from the past. She turned back toward the doorway, lifted her chin slightly, and took another step forward toward the sound of running water. Anna Keller stood about 15 feet from the doorway now, close enough to see the thin stream of water falling from one of the metal shower heads inside the building. The sound was clearer here, a steady rhythm that echoed softly against the wooden walls. It was not loud. It was not threatening. Yet the sound carried the weight of memories she had spent years trying to bury. The damp air from inside the building drifted outward through the open door, carrying the faint smell of clean water and plain soap. Anna paused again, her boots resting on the narrow path of packed gravel. Behind her the entire camp yard remained silent. The other prisoners had not moved from their places in line. They were watching her with a kind of quiet intensity that made the moment feel even heavier. Each of them understood what Anna was doing. She was walking into the unknown first. Emily Carter stood near the middle of the yard, her eyes following Anna's slow progress without interruption. The British guards had stopped whispering among themselves. Even the corporal who had first given the order now stood with his arms folded, observing the scene with careful patience. No one wanted to break the fragile balance that had formed in the quiet morning air. Anna lifted her foot again and took another step. Then another. The distance between her and the doorway shrank to 10 feet. From this angle, she could see the interior of the shower room more clearly. The floor was simple concrete. The pipes along the wall looked old but functional. Water flowed steadily from two of the shower heads, forming small clear puddles that ran slowly toward a metal drain in the center of the floor. There were no closed doors inside, no hidden corners, just an open room with running water. Anna stood there studying the space as if she were reading every detail for hidden meaning. Her hands were no longer clenched. They hung loosely at her sides, though a faint tremor still moved through her fingers. The numbers on her wrist were visible again where the sleeve of her coat had shifted slightly upward. For years those numbers had been the only proof that the past had truly happened. Now they seemed to ask a quiet question about the present. Anna took another step forward until she was standing just a few feet from the doorway. The wooden frame rose above her shoulders, and the sound of the running water filled her ears. She could feel the cool mist drifting outward, touching her face. For a long moment she did nothing. She simply stood there breathing slowly, listening to the water and the distant silence of the camp behind her. The memory in her mind tried one last time to hold her back, reminding her of the words she had once heard in another place. Shower. Soap. Quick. But this moment felt different. No one was pushing her. No one was closing a door behind her. The path behind her remained open, and the nurse who had washed her own hands minutes earlier still stood in the yard without speaking. Anna lifted her chin slightly and took the final step that brought her across the threshold. The cool air inside the room wrapped around her as she stepped onto the concrete floor. She stood there quietly beneath the pipes, looking up at the falling water. Outside, every person in the yard waited to see what would happen next. Anna Keller remained just inside the doorway of the shower room, standing on the cool concrete floor while the sound of falling water echoed softly around her. For several seconds, she did not move. Her eyes followed the thin stream pouring from the metal pipe above, watching the droplets strike the floor and scatter toward the drain in the center of the room. The air inside was slightly warmer than the yard outside, carrying the clean scent of plain soap and fresh water. Nothing about the room felt hidden. Nothing felt hurried. The door behind her remained open, allowing the pale morning light to stretch across the floor in a long, narrow strip. Anna could still see the camp yard from where she stood. The prisoners were lined up in the same place, watching carefully. Emily Carter stood among the guards about 50 feet away, her posture calm and steady. No one was shouting. No one was pushing anyone forward. Anna lifted her hand slowly and reached toward the stream of water falling from the shower head. For a brief moment, she hesitated again, her fingers hovering only inches away. The memory of another place tried to whisper in her mind, reminding her how easily ordinary words could hide something terrible. But this room was different. The pipes were exposed along the wall. The water was already running freely before she arrived. The door behind her had not closed. Anna finally moved her hand forward and let the water fall across her fingers. The sensation surprised her. It was simply water. Cool, steady, and harmless. She turned her hand slightly, letting the stream run across her palm and down to her wrist. The faded numbers there darkened slightly as the water touched them. Anna stared at them for a moment as if seeing them for the first time in years. Outside in the yard, the women had begun leaning forward just enough to see inside the doorway. The guards watched as well, their expressions no longer confused but thoughtful. Emily Carter's eyes never left Anna. She saw the moment when Anna's shoulders relaxed for the first time that morning. It was a small change, almost invisible from a distance, but Emily noticed it immediately. Anna stepped forward another foot until she stood directly beneath the shower head. The water touched her sleeve and splashed lightly against her coat. She did not step back. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief moment and let the sound of the water fill the quiet room. When she opened them again, she turned her head slightly toward the doorway. The line of prisoners outside was still watching her. Some of them had tears on their faces, though their expressions were no longer filled with panic. They were waiting for a sign. Anna slowly lifted her hand again and held it beneath the falling water, letting the droplets slide across her skin before falling to the floor. Then she looked directly toward the women outside and gave the smallest nod. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it carried a meaning stronger than any spoken order. In the yard behind Emily Carter, several of the prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time that morning, the path leading toward the shower building no longer looked like something to fear. Anna Keller kept her hand beneath the falling stream for several seconds, letting the cool water run across her fingers and down her wrist. The droplets traced the faded numbers there before sliding toward the floor. The sound was steady and calm, nothing like the noise her memory had once feared. Outside the open doorway, the prisoners were still watching. The distance between them and the building was no more than 50 feet, yet the moment felt larger than the entire yard. Anna lowered her hand slowly and stepped half a foot backward so the women outside could see her more clearly beneath the pipe. She lifted her eyes again and gave another small nod. It was not a command. It was a quiet message. The water is real. The room is open. The door is not closing. In the yard, the silence shifted. One of the women near the front of the line glanced toward Emily Carter and then back toward the doorway. Her name was Marta Vogel, a woman in her early 30s whose coat hung loosely on her shoulders after months of rationed meals and uncertain travel between camps. Marta hesitated only a moment before taking a small step forward out of the line. The gravel beneath her boots made the same soft crunch Anna had made minutes earlier. Several prisoners turned their heads toward her in surprise. Marta stopped after a few feet and looked toward Emily Carter. The nurse met her gaze with the same calm expression she had carried all morning. She did not wave her forward. She did not speak. She simply stood there, allowing the decision to belong entirely to the women themselves. Marta looked back toward the doorway where Anna now stood quietly under the running water. The sight of someone already inside the room changed something important. The place no longer looked mysterious. It no longer looked sealed away from the world. It was simply a room where water fell from pipes and collected on a concrete floor. Marta took another step forward, then another. Behind her, a second woman followed, though she moved more slowly. The line that had once been frozen in fear began to loosen by small degrees. One by one, the prisoners started moving, each step cautious but real. Emily Carter watched the movement with quiet relief. She noticed that none of the guards spoke either. Even the corporal who had first given the order kept his voice silent now. He understood that this moment was no longer about enforcing rules. It was about restoring something much harder to rebuild than discipline: trust. Inside the shower room, Anna shifted slightly to the side so the doorway remained fully visible. She wanted the others to see everything clearly. The pipes, the open door, the water falling in plain sight. Marta reached the path leading to the building and paused there for a moment. She looked back once toward the other prisoners, then forward again toward the doorway. The fear had not disappeared completely from her eyes, but it had loosened enough to allow her feet to keep moving. She walked the final steps and reached the entrance. Anna watched her quietly, and moved one step farther under the shower head so Marta could see the water striking the floor beside her boots. Marta lifted her hand slowly and reached toward the falling stream just as Anna had done moments before. When the first droplets touched her skin, she closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the cool air of the room. Outside, the women waiting in the yard saw the movement clearly. And for the first time since the morning order had been given, the path toward the building began to fill with steady footsteps instead of silence. Marta Vogel kept her hand beneath the falling water for several seconds, feeling the cool stream run across her skin before sliding down toward the concrete floor. When she opened her eyes again, she looked toward Anna Keller, who stood only a few feet away beneath another pipe. Neither woman spoke, yet the quiet exchange between them carried a meaning that words could not easily replace. Outside the doorway, the women in the yard had begun to move more freely. The narrow path leading from the line toward the shower building slowly filled with cautious footsteps. Each prisoner who stepped forward paused at least once, studying the doorway the same way Anna had earlier that morning. They listened to the sound of the water. They watched the two women already inside the room. Most importantly, they noticed that the door remained open and that no soldier stood behind it. Emily Carter remained where she had been standing since the beginning of the moment. Her boots rested in the gravel near the wooden crate where the bar of soap had been placed earlier. She observed the growing movement across the yard with a calm expression, though a quiet sense of relief had begun to settle inside her chest. The British guards stood beside her in respectful silence. None of them interrupted the slow procession of prisoners walking toward the building. The corporal glanced once toward Emily, then back toward the path. He seemed to understand now that the morning had changed direction in a way no formal order could have accomplished. Inside the shower room, Marta stepped slightly farther beneath the pipe and let the water run across both of her hands. The droplets splashed gently onto the concrete floor and joined the small stream flowing toward the metal drain. Anna shifted her position so there was space beside her for the next woman who entered. The open doorway allowed the cool morning light to spill across the floor, making the room feel less like an enclosed space and more like an extension of the yard itself. A third prisoner reached the entrance and paused there. She was older than the others, her hair streaked with gray beneath a worn scarf. She looked from Anna to Marta and then toward the pipes along the wall. The fear in her eyes softened slightly when she noticed the relaxed posture of the two women already inside. Slowly she stepped across the threshold. The water continued falling at its steady rhythm, unchanged by the quiet transformation happening around it. One by one the women entered the room, each repeating the same cautious motion of lifting a hand toward the stream before stepping fully inside. Some closed their eyes when the water touched their skin. Others looked upward as if studying the pipes carefully, confirming that nothing about the room was hidden from view. Outside, the yard grew quieter as the line shortened. Emily Carter watched the final group approach the building, their steps slower but no longer frozen with fear. She noticed Anna standing near the center of the room now, her shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been earlier. The numbers on Anna's wrist were still visible when the water touched them, but they no longer seemed to hold the same power over her movement. The moment had become something different. It was no longer about proving that the showers were safe. It had become a quiet rebuilding of trust between people who had once seen the world through entirely different sides of the war. And as the steady sound of water continued filling the small wooden building, the camp yard outside began to feel less like a place of fear and more like a place where something human had quietly returned. The steady sound of water continued echoing through the wooden structure as more women slowly stepped inside the room, each arrival carrying the same mixture of hesitation and curiosity that had filled the air since the morning began. Marta Vogel shifted slightly to the left, so another prisoner could reach the pipe beside her, and she noticed how the woman extended her hand into the falling stream with the same careful motion she herself had used minutes earlier. The water ran across their fingers and wrists, tracing thin lines down toward the concrete floor where it gathered in shallow ripples before disappearing into the metal drain. Anna Keller glanced toward the doorway again, watching as the remaining prisoners approached in smaller groups rather than a single silent line. Something in the atmosphere had changed. The rigid stillness that had once held the yard had softened into quiet movement. Outside, Emily Carter remained near the entrance, her posture relaxed but attentive. She observed the women passing by her without interference, some briefly glancing in her direction before stepping across the threshold. None of them spoke directly to her, yet their expressions carried a cautious acknowledgement that had not existed earlier that morning. The British guards nearby also sensed the shift. One soldier leaned slightly against the wooden fence, arms resting comfortably as he watched the slow procession continue. The tension that had surrounded the building only an hour earlier had faded into a calm rhythm guided by the sound of running water. Inside the room, Anna finally reached for the bar of soap that had been placed along the narrow shelf near the wall. For a moment, she simply held it, turning it in her hands as if studying an unfamiliar object. The scent of the soap drifted lightly through the damp air, clean and simple. She lathered it carefully between her palms, allowing the foam to form before rinsing it beneath the stream. Marta noticed the motion and repeated it herself, passing the bar along to the next woman without a word. The gesture spread quietly through the room as each prisoner used the soap and returned it for another. The simple act created a shared rhythm among them, something ordinary that felt almost forgotten after months of uncertainty. Outside the doorway, the final group of women reached the building. They paused briefly, listening to the steady flow of water and the soft movements inside. Emily stepped aside to leave the entrance fully open, ensuring that nothing blocked their view. When the first of the remaining prisoners crossed into the room, she did so with a steadier step than those before her. The example set by Marta and Anna had quietly replaced fear with cautious confidence. As the room gradually filled with the sound of water and quiet movement, the camp yard beyond the wooden walls settled into an unexpected calm. The morning sun had climbed higher above the barracks, casting long beams of light across the gravel path. Emily Carter looked toward the open doorway once more and allowed herself a small breath of relief. Nothing about the moment was dramatic or loud. It was built from small decisions, quiet courage, and the simple reassurance of water flowing from ordinary pipes. Yet within that quiet space, something meaningful had taken root, a fragile but unmistakable sense that dignity could begin returning even in a place shaped by the long shadow of war. The water continued running for several more minutes as the last of the women finished washing their hands and faces, and slowly the movement inside the wooden structure began to settle into a quiet stillness that felt very different from the tension that had filled the yard earlier that morning. Marta Vogel stepped back from the pipe and gently brushed a few drops of water from her sleeves, noticing how the cool air inside the room now felt fresher, almost lighter. Around her the other prisoners moved calmly, some drying their hands on small cloths they carried, others simply letting the remaining droplets fall away as they stood for a moment in thoughtful silence. Anna Keller stood beside Marta and looked toward the open doorway where sunlight stretched across the floor in a bright rectangle. The light reflected softly off the damp concrete, creating small shimmering patterns that shifted each time someone walked past. Outside the doorway, Emily Carter remained where she had been standing, her posture steady but no longer rigid. She watched as the first few women stepped back into the open yard. Their pace was slow but no longer uncertain. One by one, they crossed the short distance between the building and the gravel path that led back toward the barracks. None of them rushed. Instead, they moved with the quiet composure of people adjusting to a moment that had not unfolded the way they once feared. A light breeze moved across the camp yard, carrying the faint scent of soap and clean water beyond the wooden walls. The British guards nearby observed the prisoners returning in small groups, but there was no sign of alarm or urgency in their expressions. The simple routine of the morning had settled into something almost ordinary. Marta and Anna were among the final women to leave the room. As Marta stepped outside, she paused for a moment and looked across the open yard. The sky above the camp was clear, a pale blue stretching across the horizon with only a few thin clouds drifting slowly overhead. It had been a long time since she had noticed something as simple as the color of the sky. Anna followed her gaze for a brief moment before turning her attention back to the path ahead. The gravel shifted softly beneath their shoes as they walked. Several other prisoners were already approaching the barracks doors, speaking quietly among themselves in low voices that carried a tone of cautious relief. Emily Carter watched the final pair step into the sunlight, and she offered a small nod that neither woman fully noticed Yet the gesture reflected a quiet understanding that had formed throughout the morning. The wooden structure behind them still echoed faintly with the sound of water flowing through the pipes, but even that sound would soon fade as the valves were closed and the room returned to silence. What remained was not the fear that had once filled the yard, but the memory of a simple moment when uncertainty had slowly given way to calm. Marta and Anna continued walking with the others toward the barracks, the rhythm of their steps steady and unhurried, carrying with them a quiet sense that even within the difficult landscape of war, small moments of dignity could still appear and leave their mark on everyone who witnessed them.